Everybody. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Deanna Palm with the Hillsboro Chamber of Commerce. This is one of our small business solutions workshops. We are actually doing it today in conjunction with the Beaverton Chamber. So if you are a Beaverton Chamber member, welcome and thanks for joining us. It is our pleasure to have Chris Eyler here with us today with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As I'm sure many of you have heard, lots of conversation around a stimulus package at the federal government level. And Chris is here to kind of outline what that might look like and potentially how that might benefit your business, and if there's things that we can do to help move it along. So Chris, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Deanna. Just give me a second while I share my screen. Okay, great. As Deanna said, my name is Chris Eyler. I'm the U.S. Chamber's Executive Director for the Northwest region. And as Deanna explained, I'm just going to quickly give you an overview of what is going on in Washington, D.C. right now. There are a lot of moving parts. Nothing is certain yet, but we have reason to be cautiously optimistic that something may get agreed to either later this week or sometime next week. So first of all, I just want to touch on what we are seeing in the economy. We have been seeing for quite some time that the pandemic's impacts are impacting the economy in a very uneven way. After an initial collapse back in the spring, some sectors of the economy have managed to recover. Largely, those sectors of the economy are in the technology sector, software services, retail, financial services, and a lot of the other sectors of the economy where it's easier to work remotely and work from home. However, we are also seeing a far greater number of sectors of the economy continuing to struggle: travel, entertainment, food services, hospitality, personal services, any sector that really requires a lot of face-to-face interaction with the customer or high volumes of customers. Those sectors are continuing to struggle greatly, and what we are seeing and what we have been seeing since over the summer is what we have referred to and what you've likely heard in the press reported as a K-shaped recovery. As this next slide shows, there's still over 17 sectors of the economy classified by the Bureau of Labor Statistics where unemployment is at least 15%, if not greater, lower than what it was back in February. As you can see, the range in these sectors of the drop in employment is anywhere from 16% below what it was in February to as much as 43.5% below what it was in February. In general, what we have seen in the most recent Census Bureau survey of small businesses, nearly 3 times as many small businesses have reported reducing their number of staff. More than 4 times as many small businesses have reported reducing the number of staff hours as those that have reported increasing them. Nearly 7 times as many small businesses have reported decreased revenue as those that have reported an increase in revenue. In Oregon, to bring this a little closer to home, 16% of Oregon businesses have reported decreasing unemployment, 31% have reported decreasing employee hours, 44% of Oregon businesses have reported decreased revenue. In addition to this, by the end of the month, much of the CARES Act aid programs, specifically the extended federal unemployment benefit, is going to expire on December 26th. This means that over 12 million Americans and over 113,000 Oregons face losing their extended unemployment benefit by December 26th. So what we are very concerned about, and the message that we are delivering to Congress, is that if they do not act and do not act soon, we are looking at a potential double dip recession. Now, as I said, there has been a lot of movement over the past week, and there is some potential break in the ice or break in the logjam between the two sides back in Washington, D.C. Last Tuesday, a bipartisan group of senators and House members put forward a framework of a potential deal to pass a phase 4 pandemic relief package. Now, I need to caution you all, this is right now just a framework. Basically, what they put forward is what I've put forward on this slide, which is a series of budgetary and appropriations funding levels that they believe can be agreed to in Congress. This includes over 160 billion for state and local and tribal governments, additional aid for unemployment insurance that would, in addition to extending the federal unemployment benefit, would also provide an additional 300 billion or $300 per week on top of what the state would provide. It includes, importantly, additional aid to small businesses, particularly in the form of an extension of the Paycheck Protection Program, as well as additional funding for the Small Business Administration's Economic Industry Disaster Loan Program. It includes aid to the airlines and transit agencies, aid for vaccine development and distribution. It would provide additional aid to extend the current student loan forbearance program, as well as provide aid for childcare, broadband, and opioid treatment. Also, in addition to the funding, it calls on the federal government to create a temporary short-term liability shield for businesses to protect them from unfair lawsuits, giving states enough time to develop their own liability protection plan. All told, the bipartisan framework calls on an additional $908 billion in aid. As for the outlook for this, things are very much in flux right now. First of all, we are waiting for the bipartisan group to come back with more specifics on their plan, specifically legislative language, particularly around how they will handle small business aid, how they will handle the liability protections, and whether or not the deal will ultimately include aid to state, local, and tribal governments. This is a big step forward. If you'll recall, prior to the election, Speaker Pelosi and House Democrats were holding very strong to their HEROES Act, which was a $3.5 trillion aid package, while Senator McConnell and Senate Republicans were very adamant that the aid package be no larger than $500 billion. So this is a big step forward. Speaker Pelosi has come down quite a bit from that $3.5 trillion mark. Senator McConnell is still, he has not weighed in specifically on the bipartisan framework, but it's a good sign that both Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate, are urging their members to be supportive of the bipartisan framework as a good starting point for negotiations. The White House also has indicated that they see the bipartisan framework as a good starting point for negotiations. And so we remain cautiously optimistic that this can, in some form, be agreed to. As for the business community and the U.S. Chamber's priorities, the bipartisan framework does fall into and touch on a lot of the issues that we have prioritized in the phase 4 negotiations. If you've been on previous webinars with me, with any of the other chambers, I don't think I've done this with you all since we've rolled out our phase 4 priorities, but our priorities fall into 5 buckets: aid to small and mid-sized businesses, liability protections, support for childcare and elementary and secondary education, additional aid from the federal government for unemployment, and state and local assistance. Of these, clearly a continued aid to small and mid-sized businesses in light of what we're seeing in the economy is our top priority. And this really, our priority here is basically to extend and expand the Paycheck Protection Program, which you all know is a loan program that converts to a forgivable grant that does not have to be repaid so long as all of the loan proceeds are spent on payroll and other specified expenses. We want to see that program both extended and expanded. We want to allow businesses that have already exhausted their first Paycheck Protection Program loan to take out a second loan. We want to see the forgiveness process streamlined for smaller loans under $150,000 or less. We want to see those loans basically presumed forgiven. And then, of course, we want to see the Paycheck Protection Program opened up so that all nonprofits, including our state and local chamber partners, can access the Paycheck Protection Program. In addition to aid to small businesses, our other main priority is getting protections from predatory and opportunistic lawsuits put into this package. We are not asking for a blanket liability protection. What we're asking for is a temporary, short-term, and targeted safe harbor for businesses that that make a good faith effort to follow public health guidance as they reopen. Of course, businesses that are engaged in willful misconduct or gross negligence wouldn't be able to avail themselves of this protection, but we feel that businesses that are doing everything they can to maintain safety at their place of business, following public health coming down from CDC, OSHA, and state and local public health officials, those businesses should be afforded some protection from lawsuits, given all of the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic. As far as childcare goes, there's going to be a lot of new requirements placed on both schools and childcare facilities once they are allowed to reopen. Of course, we want childcare and schools to follow public health guidance and not open until it's safe. But when they do reopen, there's going to be a lot of new expenses placed on them as they have to implement social distancing, PPE for staff and students, and other health measures. This is money that these facilities simply do not have, so we need to make sure that the federal government provides some additional aid to help them open safely. Unemployment, I think that goes without saying. As long as the pandemic is here, there are going to be large numbers of employees who simply are not going to be working because their place of business isn't open. And unfortunately, there are going to be a number of jobs that simply do not come back. So we want to make sure that the federal government is continuing to support those without jobs, helping them get training for to find new jobs if their jobs are not going to come back. And then lastly, on state and local assistance, many state governments as well as local governments are on the verge of running out of money. This is largely due because tax revenues have fallen through the floor, and they simply are not seeing the revenues that they had counted on at the beginning of the year. This is also a particular concern because many states are exhausting their unemployment trust funds. And one of the concerns we have is that a lot of states implement an automatic tax increase on businesses once those trust funds are exhausted. So we are asking that the federal government step in to help these state and local governments both keep their unemployment trust funds funded and also make sure that they are not having to start laying off police officers, firefighters, and other first responders in order to save money. Again, the outlook, I want to say, I don't want to make any promises that this is going to happen for sure. Given how things have gone this year, anything can happen, but we remain cautiously optimistic that something can get agreed to. Congress has to deal with the federal funding legislation by the end of the week. They either have to pass another continuing resolution to give them more time to negotiate funding for the next fiscal year. Right now, the conventional wisdom is that they will do a short-term continuing resolution to give themselves an additional week to continue these negotiations. The hope is that they will come to an agreement on all federal spending for the remainder of 2021, and a phase 4 pandemic relief package can hitch a ride on that package. Most of the parties, there is pretty broad agreement on both sides of Capitol Hill and the White House that something needs to be done, but there continues to be a lot of disagreement on specifically how to go about doing that. Right now, there is pretty broad agreement on aid to small and mid-sized businesses, particularly extending and expanding the Paycheck Protection Program. Where there is a lot of disagreement, though, is on liability protections. House Democrats do not want to provide liability protections. Senate Republicans do. Likewise, there is a lot of disagreement on providing state and local assistance. Again, House Democrats have made this, drawn a line in the sand and say that they need to have aid to state and local assistance, whereas Senate Republicans are reluctant to provide this aid. So those are really the two main hangups. In addition to those issues, there's also an ongoing discussion on whether to provide direct payments to individuals in the form of another $1,200 check. That is not something that is an issue that the U.S. Chamber is largely agnostic on. As you can imagine, being an organization focused on business, our main focus here is on making sure that aid is provided to small and mid-sized businesses and getting those liability protections in place. So with that, that really is the current state of play, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. That is very succinct. Appreciate that. And I think we can open it up if anybody has a question. If you could just raise your hand and I will unmute you. Oh, sorry, Brad. Go ahead.
So assuming this goes forward as you're speaking, you know, they come up with a decision or move forward in the next couple of weeks, what would you say is a timeline on actual funds rolling out based on like the original act that they passed through? I can't remember how long it was, but between agreement and money hitting the street.
Well, I think it depends on the particular aspect of the plan, but it'll be pretty quick. There's still $130 billion in unspent Paycheck Protection Program money sitting in the Treasury right now. So really, with respect to that, it's just a matter of them flipping the switch and giving the authority to issue new loans. Likewise, there's a lot of other funds from the CARES Act, particularly from the Main Street Lending Program, that's still unspent. So there's already a lot of money in the pipeline that really they just have to flip the switch, and a lot of it can start going out pretty quickly. With respect to some of the other provisions, like state and local aid, I don't know how quickly that can move out. That would be a new appropriation. But like I said, there's, one of the things that they can do in this plan, and one of the things that's being negotiated, is there's still a lot of unspent CARES Act money that through rescissions, they can just reappropriate that and start pushing it out pretty quickly.
Robert. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm used to the moderator being in control of muting.
I'm not in
So
control
Chris,
of anything, Robert.
So Chris, with the PPP loan, I've been hearing something about some kinds of constraints or rules or how they're going to qualify people in this round versus the first round. Have you been hearing anything around the structure of who will be eligible?
We've been hearing the same thing. I don't have that information. Like I said, right now, what we've seen is just the budget numbers. So we're waiting to get legislative language from the bipartisan group. We're hoping that we'll start to see some of that legislative language and how they're going to structure the programs later today, or if not today, tomorrow, or shortly thereafter. So I'm sorry, I don't have more information on that right now.
Dan.
Chris, you stated that the auto forgiveness of the PPP less than 150,000 was in your goals. Is that mean that it's in the act this time for passage this week, or is that still a separate legislation?
No, our ask is that it will be included in whatever is agreed to. Again, I know it's a little confusing, but what has been put out, all that's been put out right now are those budget numbers. They have not put out the legislative language and what will actually be from a policy standpoint in this agreement, because they're still hammering out the legislative language. We hope that the agreement will include more streamlined forgiveness, as well as an expanded PPP program. Namely the ability to take out a second loan, and some of these other provisions that would make it more accessible for the smallest of businesses. One of the problems we saw with the original PPP was the money wasn't getting to the smallest of small businesses. So we have been told that they are working on language that would make it easier to get that money into the hands of those businesses, but we have yet to see it.
Keith.
Chris, good morning. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it very, very much. I want to kind of circle back around just a little bit. And from what I'm reading, I think you're spot on. I think Mr. McConnell is has said that they're struggling because the real bottleneck, I think, to moving this 908 billion forward is the reluctance on the Democratic caucus to accept any kind of business liability protection. I find it a little bit strange that they're very vocal, that caucus is very vocal about the support of liability protection in education and where it relates to that, which I agree. I mean, but in your opinion, what's the reluctance to provide that cover for business? I think and I think you suggested it very clearly, is that, you know, if business has done the right thing to protect its people, we're trying to provide some level of protection for those businesses against, errant liability. What's the real rub? I mean, is it political, or is that what's causing the drawback there? Why won't that move forward?
Well, I think that, it's twofold. First, the Democratic caucus tends to be much more sympathetic to the requests of the trial bar. And so obviously the trial bar is not going to want to have any kind of prohibition put in place on their ability to pursue lawsuits against businesses. I also think that there is this misconception that what we're asking for is a blanket liability protection for all lawsuits, and that is not what we're asking for. Like, what we are asking for is a temporary, targeted, safe harbor. If a business is following public health guidance, so it's really, what we really need is, with respect to liability protections, we need more businesses calling into their member of Congress and their Senate delegation and urging them to put these protections in place. The one thing that we are hearing in our negotiations with Capitol Hill is that they're just not hearing that much from businesses about the need for these protections. So to the extent that you all can weigh in with Susan Bonamici and Senators Wyden and Merkley, and those of you who are closer into downtown Portland who can weigh in with Mr. Blumenauer, that would be very helpful to us. I think the negotiation really is focused on the Senate. So Merkley and Wyden are really the ones who need to be hearing from the Oregon business community on this. I also want to stress, and this is not so much an issue with the Democrats, but they also need to be hearing about the need to include 501c6 nonprofits in this legislation, particularly for giving the chambers of commerce access to the Paycheck Protection Program. When it comes to 501c6 nonprofits, we want to make sure that the language included is taken from the HEROES Act, which is all nonprofits, and places as few restrictions on chambers that have an advocacy program. So going back to what Deanna said at the beginning, what you all can do to help, it's twofold. Weigh in with the delegation, asking them to include liability protections. Make sure it's stressed that what we're asking for are temporary restrictions, not blanket liability, as I think that is what they think we're asking for. And also to weigh in, asking that they include all nonprofits in the Paycheck Protection Program.
Tom H.
Hey, good morning, Chris. Thanks a million for being here today. We really appreciate it. I think we're all little people in the big pond. And, I go from having 26 employees to being a one-man band today. And I was able to get a PPP loan through my bank. So with this new thrust of money, will it run pretty much the same thing, that you would go back to your same business bank and apply through the PP loan that way once again?
Presumably, yes, that would be how it would work. Given the need, we don't want to have to reinvent the wheel here.
Right.
You know from your own experience with the PPP that the initial 4 to 5 weeks after it rolled out were pretty rough. So we don't want to have to go through that again. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So our understanding is that this would simply be an expansion of PPP. They will likely make some changes to, as I said earlier, try and get more of that money into the small businesses,
Yeah.
a lot of minority serving businesses and minority owned businesses. But largely, you would just see an extension of what we've already have in place, and allowing businesses to take out second loans that have already exhausted their existing loans.
So another question for you too. When you look at the whole picture, coast to coast and locally, are you seeing that our local area governments understand the little business people, or is it the federal people that understand the small business person? Who's the greatest strength out there for us?
I think it really is kind of state to state, and so I cover a 6-state region, and it was very stark for a while there, where some of the states, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, were all taking the CARES Act money that came to them that was designated for state governments, and they were creating their own grant programs to help fill in a lot of the gaps that weren't being filled by the Paycheck Protection Program. I know that you all in Oregon, and a lot of the chambers I deal with up here in Washington, were really frustrated because Governor Inslee and Governor Brown were kind of sitting on a lot of that money,
Right,
and not pushing it out to businesses. So it really is kind of a state by state thing when it comes to whether the government is focused more on businesses or other things.
Chris, I heard this morning on the news that the sticking points were with the business liabilities and the state and local governments, and that was kind of the negotiation. And it just kind of seems like an unholy conversation for chambers of commerce to have, in terms of give our state and local governments less money if we can get more business protection. That just kind of went, that's a fight I'd prefer not to have. Any insight into what that's going to look like in terms of a negotiation? Will it pit the business community against the local and state governments?
Well, from our point of view, both of those things need to be in the bill. Because as I pointed out, if states if states go bankrupt, or states run out of money, particularly with respect to their unemployment trust fund, that's going to trigger an automatic tax increase on businesses. So we want to make sure that those governments are continuing to get money so that they can continue funding unemployment, their state obligation for unemployment. And then as far as liability protections go, it doesn't, if businesses are going to start getting sued, it doesn't make much sense to give them an aid if there's not going to be a business there to help. We were told, I was on a call with our DC staff right before this webinar, and my boss mentioned that one of the senators leading the negotiations proposed just dropping the liability and the state aid issues altogether in this package, and then revisiting it next year. And that proposal didn't go over well. So both sides want to see their respective provision included. So the negotiations are continuing. So I don't know. I don't really know what's going to happen here. Both sides have really dug in on this.
Right. Well, on the upside, I did hear that Oregon's, tax revenue from the sales of marijuana are substantially over what they anticipated. So there you have it, folks.
Well, one of the good things that Oregon has going for it is that, a lot of the states that are having revenue problems because their sales tax revenues are down so sharply. And since you all don't have sales tax,
the other thing I noticed that you had said on the recovering industries, you included retail. I was surprised by that. Is that just because of online kind of sales that are happening? Yeah.
And so that is kind of a general statement. Large aspects of the retail sector are doing quite well, but there are some aspects of the retail sector that aren't doing so well. So your big box stores, Amazons, anyone with a large online presence, they're doing very well. But smaller mom and pop retail establishments, those establishments are still having troubles.
Which to I've said this before and I say it about restaurants, but as well as local mom and pop retail that are really become the characteristics of your communities. While there's nothing wrong with the large, box stores, when you're traveling to a community, you don't go to a place where you can go to it in your own backyard. You go to those very unique, the retail outlets that have things that are really speak to the community that you're visiting, the restaurants as well, the food and flavor and culture. And I think that I'm concerned that that's going to be the sector of our communities that is really wiped out. And how do we tell that story to the federal government of, the decades it will take to rebuild that?
Mhm. Well, I think just for the purposes of getting the focus on this negotiation, your congressional delegation is pretty much in agreement with us on the need for more aid to small businesses. So that is a good thing. They recognize exactly what you're saying, that it isn't just the big retailers and the big box stores and the other major corporations, but we would lose a lot if we allowed a lot of these smaller employers and smaller businesses to go out of business. It would really destroy a lot of the characteristic of a lot of our communities. So your delegation gets that. So I don't think there's a lot more you need to do in terms of relaying that message to them. But I do think they need to understand that it isn't just about providing direct aid or PPP loans or SBA loans to these businesses. They also need protection from the threat of a lawsuit that might stem from coronavirus. Because, like I said, if a business, a lot of these small businesses cannot afford to fight these lawsuits, and it doesn't matter how much aid we provide them if they're going to run out of money defending against an unfair lawsuit. So I think it's a twofold message that you need to deliver. Yes, they need the aid to keep in business, but they also need to be protected from the threat of an unfair lawsuit that could just as easily drive them out of business.
And is the EIDL loan complete? The EIDL, I guess, grant or loan program, is that completely off the table in terms of replenishment?
No, that is part of the bipartisan framework. It's additional funding for both the PPP and the EIDL.
Got it. Okay.
And remember, there's still, in addition to that money that they put forward, there's also that money that's still unspent from the CARES Act for the PPP.
Right. Which is kind of surprising to me.
Right. Well, I think what happened is, in the initial appropriation, the money went out the door very fast. And then when they replenished it in late April, I think, they did put it in some new provisions to kind of slow down that process. And that worked. But what ended up happening is that by the end of the summer, everyone who needed a PPP had largely gotten it, except for those really, really small businesses that they don't have an established relationship with a bank, or they're just very difficult to reach. And that was the problem that we were seeing with you kind of consistently had this $130 billion sitting in the account that wasn't going out because there were all these small, very, very, very small businesses that just were having trouble accessing it.
So, but isn't it still a race to December 30th at this point? That money goes away, and there's nothing in sort of, or is there anything in this framework that potentially would remove that date? And so, because I know that local governments and state governments are running to the finish line, trying to get money out the door, and not exactly the most, strategic method as they dump it out of the plane, an airplane hangar, just because they need to get it out the door. Is there potentially a lift on that, and that is a part of this package?
Yeah, that's part of the ongoing negotiation, is to extend that deadline.
Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Dan.
Chris, do you know, so we were an early filer for PPP. We got in like in April. Under the original rules, had to spend it within 8 weeks, which we did. We paid a lot of our employees back, paid them in some cases more than they were making when they were working for us. And then they changed all the rules. And that was all while we were closed. So during that 8-week period, we don't have enough to qualify for full forgiveness. And we don't fully qualify for all the extensions. So at this point, my position is it was a mistake to file for PPP. So, and I wouldn't do it again if it were there. So has some of that, that constant change and kind of fixing some of those gaps, has some of that been fixed yet so that I won't be hesitant to apply for another PPP if I can get a second one?
I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see what they agree to. I think, and Deanna knows this, we put together a series of guide documents on PPP as they kept making changes. So depending on what is agreed to and what they put out, assuming they can come to an agreement and pass it, we will continue to put those guide documents out that explain how the program will work based on those changes. But until we see that legislative language and what they can come up with, I can't really answer your question.
Hey, Chris, I've got a question on, and I understand it's just a framework. Has there been any talk on, you said there was in that framework, it was 25 billion for housing assistance. Is that that the federal government would dole out, or would that go to states to dole out as in the form of rent assistance? And then on the commercial rent assistance side, is that just something the states would have to figure out on their own with whatever they get as a state and local payment from this package?
Right now, the discussion's just focused on housing and rental assistance for residences. I'm not entirely sure if they would administer this directly from the federal government or they would work through the states. Again, I'm sorry I sound like a broken record here, but until we see what they put in the legislative language, I can't really say.
Do you know of any federal program that has that ability to run a housing assistance program? Because it seems like in most housing programs nationwide are through the states and local jurisdictions, funded by federal money, of course, but the trickle down effect.
I don't know of any federal program. That doesn't mean there isn't one, but I think they find that the easiest way to move the money out is through the existing state agencies that are set up to do that.
Other questions? Tom?
Yeah, Chris, just kind of looking down the road and realizing that, we get the PPP and some financial help. What are you seeing or what are you forecasting whereby this money will help us get back on our feet, get back into some normalness? Do you see things bouncing back as early as May or June, or what are you seeing? What are you hearing?
It really all is going to all depend on the vaccine rollout and how quickly and how in what kind of an organized way they can distribute the vaccine. Until we get past this current spike and we start seeing widespread vaccinations, it's hard to really predict what the economy is going to look like with any certainty. Once we get that vaccine out there and get widespread distribution, I think there's a lot of confidence that you're going to start to see the economy start to rebound. And our focus long term, as long as the pandemic's here, making sure businesses are getting aid to continue paying their employees, and we don't go either see a double dip recession or go deeper into recession than we already are. The pandemic and pandemic response is going to be our top priority. But more broadly, there is going to be an effort once President-elect Biden is sworn in to do additional economic stimulus. And our message to Congress is, yes, we want to do economic stimulus, but we need to do what can be agreed to and be agreed to in a bipartisan way. And our focus is going to be on transportation and infrastructure investments, because that is something both sides agree to. That's something we can have an immediate impact on the economy. So we're going to be focused, in addition to continued pandemic aid, we're going to be focused pretty much exclusively for the first half of 2021 on stimulus in the form of transportation and infrastructure investment. But going back to your question again, like until we can get some control over the virus and get those vaccinations out, it's hard to make any kind of long-term predictions on the economy with any certainty.
All right, folks, any other questions? We've got a little time. All right, well, hearing and seeing none. Chris, thank you again. Appreciate it. Hope that you'd be willing to come back as we get potentially another package moved forward, and maybe if there's questions or some more conversation we can have around whatever actually we agree to, that would be great.
Absolutely.
All right, folks, anything else? Are we all done? Excellent. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Have a great day. Stay safe.